Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining our program today. We'd now like to start Sasakawa Peace Foundation SPF China Observer Forum. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the SPF China Observer under the auspices of Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. The topic today is China's perception of the situation in Afghanistan. The main speaker are as follows. From the Kwansei Gakuin University, Professor Ichiro Inoue, and as discussed, we have with us the professor of the University of Tokyo, who is guiding our program, Dr. Akio Takahara. The moderator will be myself, Ohara, with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. With regard to the situation in Afghanistan, the US troops had withdrawn, and on August 15th, the current government toppled. So the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan was a strategic decision, but then the implementation of the withdrawal is considered to be a failure. That is the assessment in the United States. They wanted to withdraw by September 11th. They wanted to complete the withdrawal by September 11th. This was a political show geared toward the domestic audience in the U.S. And so the views of the intelligence agencies in the United States and also the views of the allies in of Europe were ignored by the Biden government. They went ahead with the withdrawal. And also they informed the deadline for the withdrawal beforehand. So that has caused the current situation in Afghanistan, according to many. Now, against the backdrop, how does China perceive the situation in Afghanistan? The media in China say that as a result of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, this will be positive as well as negative for both U.S.-China relations. As far as the positive implications are concerned, the pressure from the West vis-a-vis China will have gone away. And also as a result of the failure, the confidence of the allies were lost. The negative implications are as follows. The U.S. has now abandoned the burden of Afghanistan, which means that they'll be able to employ all resources to exert pressure on China as a result. So the Chinese perception is, as I've just indicated, and various other countries have different views about China's perception. But then there are some issues that are not reported by the Chinese media. The greatest concern is the uncertainty, domestic uncertainty in China, the domestic situation in China, which is not reported in the U.S. The Afghanistan borders with China and the Islamic fundamentalists' assistance to Muslim minorities in China is being implemented. And China is very fearful of that situation. That is the view. But then what I've talked about is only the current situation. In order to understand the situation on hand, it's important that you understand not only the current situation, not just involving China, but as far as the perceptions of the neighboring countries have to be considered to grasp the overall situation. At the same time, we need to take a look at the vertical timelines or time series as well. Historically, with regard to Afghanistan, how has China perceived Afghanistan over its history? So we need to take a look at the horizontal and the vertical axis. We need to take a look at these two vectors in order to understand the Afghanistan situation in its entirety. Today we have with us Professor Inoue. He will talk about the historical backdrop as well, and will share with us his views about China's perception of the situation in Afghanistan. Professor Inoue, please.
Thank you. As has been kindly introduced, my name is Inoue. I am with the Kwansei Gakuin University. What is the perception of China over the Afghanistan situation? Can I have my PowerPoint, please? As has been just introduced, on the 15th of August, Taliban has placed Kabul under control. So for the past 2 decades of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan has ended in abject failure. That seems to be the impression of the world. And the United States have left the vacuum in Afghanistan by its withdrawal. China may come in, but it often happens that they use the prism of the U.S.-China the confrontation. But how is China looking at Taliban? Is it to be positive for its national interest or not? In order to have a better understanding, we need to look back into history. How has China engaged with this region? Afghanistan, as you may know, is a mountainous region. It does not boast of that much of a developed industry. It is still poor. Ethnically, it is mostly Pashtun, but at the most 50%. There are other races and ethnic groups such as Tajik and Uzbek. Always an issue of how to bring the peaceful coexistence. And historically, Afghanistan has been the point of great games of the great powers of the Great Britain, Russia, over Eurasia. But it was also said to be the graveyard of the imperial powers, with the failure of the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan and Taliban once again regaining its power. Once again, Afghanistan is now being said to be a graveyard of the powers. From the 1950s, Afghanistan was under the influence of USSR, so the influence of China was quite limited. As you know very well, in 1979, USSR has made aggression into Afghanistan. There has been strong protest, so USSR had to withdraw in 1989. And then in 1996, Taliban has placed the capital city, Kabul, under control. Taliban had a close relationship with Al-Qaeda under bin Laden and was said to have had a terrorist training camp within the country. So there has been strong criticism vis-à-vis Afghanistan, such as the United Nations Security Council resolutions. And with the 9/11 in 2001, the United States has asked Afghanistan to hand over bin Laden to the Taliban, the government, but it has been refused. So based upon the UN Security Council resolution, the attack was made into Afghanistan. Now, of course, there were publicly the opposition seen from the allies of the United States, including France and Germany. But what is noteworthy is that China had supported the United States in its fight against terrorism. So they had the collaboration with the newly born Bush administration. And 2 years prior to that, back in 1999, with the NATO, U.S. military aircraft had mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy here in Belgrade. And then in 2001, in April, in offshore the Hainan Island, the U.S. the military, the reconnaissance aircraft EP-3 has come into contact with the Chinese PLA Navy aircraft. There has been rising tension. So the U.S.-China relations were quite unstable up until then. But with the fight against terrorism, China has chosen to fight alongside with the United States. So the relationship between the two powers have become more stable, with China participating in the joint fight against terrorism. It has become an excuse to bring under control its own the Xinjiang, the Uyghur, the territory, the terrorist activities. Now, in looking at the diplomatic priorities, Afghanistan was not that high ranked. China has borders with 14 countries. So even though it was a short border, it also has a border with Afghanistan. But as you can see with this map, through a very narrow corridor in the mountainous area, just a very short distance. China has the greatest concern over the Taliban support of the terrorist groups and with the drug the trade to do with the national security issue, the non-traditional security issue. for example, impact to the Xinjiang Uyghur, the territory, and also the independence of the movement in the East Turkestan, and the terrorist activity has become the biggest concern for China. So China is not sympathizing at all with Taliban. It is still having suspicion as to how the Taliban may behave. So how to stabilize and secure the Xinjiang territory has always been the point of concern and interest of China. So it has been very carefully looking at its relationship with Taliban. Now, after 9/11, so China has opted to take the position of fighting together with the United States. The war on Afghanistan, China did not criticize the United States. But in the reconstruction process, with the West taking the initiative, China was not comfortable being subjugated. So China has basically worked with the United States, but not had taken any leading role in terms of the Afghanistan under the interim government with the U.S. in the control. For the ISAF, China has not sent the PLA as the PKO, the members. On the other hand, the instability in Afghanistan would be negative for China. So the so-called Kabul process, talking about the peace in Afghanistan, should move forward in a stable manner. And China thought that that would be in its own interest as well, to try to stabilize Afghanistan. Now, looking at the point of view of researchers in China, looking at the history of Afghanistan and the contention amongst the different tribes, with the democratic state to be built under the new Afghanistan situation with the U.S. taking initiative, how it may develop, China was always skeptical. And China has always thought that it would not be easy to try to bring Taliban to a collapse, militarily speaking. So when the U.S. will move out, Taliban will always recover and resume, was China's the viewpoint. And now, whether Taliban, although it has resumed power once again, be able to, in a stable manner, to have an effective control over the whole country of Afghanistan, China is still being carefully watching. So, looking at the vice of Taliban as well, try to work with the Taliban in the long term. That seems to be the stance of China. Looking at one salient point of how China has related itself of Afghanistan, you should look at the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the Shanghai 5 being launched in 1996. The 2001 SCO has been established. And then in 2001, 9/11 has occurred. So Afghanistan was always the point of concern and interest. The stability of Afghanistan would be stability here for Central Asia. So Afghanistan was always on the agenda of SCO. In 2002, SCO has designated Taliban to be assisting in terror. So that has given a consent in trying to oust the Taliban government. From the point of SCO, with the President Karzai of the interim government was thought to be the puppet of the United States. But on the other hand, Karzai was invited over to the SCO conferences to try to strengthen the relationship. And Afghanistan is observer, the SCO. Of course, Turkmenistan is an exception, but almost all the countries in the region have joined in the SCO. And the latest report says that Iran is also requesting to be the member of SCO. So Afghanistan is also included and is one of the major trading partners, looking at bilateral relationship and also the SCO and other multilateral multilateral framework, China has continued to engage with Afghanistan. In 2012, China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, the tripartite dialogue framework was established with the security issues that are being addressed as a topic. Pakistan, which has always been a friend to China, has always supported the Taliban and have engaged in dialogue with the Taliban. Now, looking at China, how it has reacted to Taliban resuming the power once again. On the 15th of August, when Taliban has brought the Kabul under control, there has been a media report on many Afghan people making exodus from the country. It has been said to be the failure of the U.S. diplomacy, and is said to symbolize the decline in the U.S. The power and influence. Whether China will fill in the vacuum left by the United States, people tend to think as such. Of course, that is one perspective, but with China, as the Taliban continue to bring Afghanistan under her control, what is the position and view of China? Now, the U.S. failure in Afghanistan has been taken as a positive step forward for China within the perspective of the China confronting the United States in competition with the United States. But China is not actually trusting the Taliban. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has criticized the United States for its irresponsible withdrawal. But looking at the Chinese real intent, they may still think that the U.S. governing Afghanistan may have been better. In any case, Minister Wang Yi has invited over the leaders of the Taliban on the 28th of July to have a dialogue. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said that Taliban is an important military and a political force in Afghanistan, although China has not yet officially recognized the interim government. On the 18th of August, according to the press secretary of the Foreign Ministry of China, China will have to wait until the new government is officially being launched. So it is a delicate the way of the statement. So in that the process, China may recognize the government or try to make some coordination. On the 19th, the next day, in the press conference of the Foreign Ministry, the spokeswoman has said that the current behavior of the Taliban seems to be rather practical and positive and favorable. The Afghanistan, in its circumstances, to gain the support of the people and to establish a political system with the embracing attitude, and China would like to encourage Afghanistan to take a more moderate domestic and foreign policies. So compared to the radical stance in the past, after Taliban has once again resumed power at this time, different from the past, may be going into a more reasonable and realistic position. So the China is saying that we should discard stereotypical impression of Taliban. Taliban is no longer something in the extreme, may not support the terrorists, and if it may become more realistic in its political the way of other things, then China may endorse the effective control by Taliban on the Afghanistan. On the 8th of September, the extended foreign ministers conference on the topic of Afghanistan was held on a virtual basis with the G7 countries at the main. China and Russia have not participated, but some of the Middle East and the Central Asian countries have participated. On the other hand, on the 14th of September, the SCO has held a conference in Dushanbe. And not only China, but India, Pakistan, as well as some of the observers have participated, including Afghanistan. Minister Wang Yi has criticized the U.S. responsibility, being the one who has actually instigated the developments in Afghanistan. On the other hand, he has continued to say that China will be willing to act as an intermediary to play a constructive role. Now, how will China continue to engage with Afghanistan?
To what extent can China play a constructive role in Afghanistan? There are some divergence of views even within China. For example, when it comes to foreign policy and security community, the strategists and also people who are focused on the regional situation, between these two groups, there seems to be a divergence of views. For example, for retired military personnel of China, they frequently appear in the media and they make very aggressive statements. It's one of those camps has said as follows: for China, this is a golden opportunity for China to replace the United States. China should seize leadership, effectively support Afghanistan, and fill the void of the power. Afghanistan has mineral resources. So these are some of the statements made by former Chinese military personnel. But then, experts who are focused on the situation, the Chinese regional experts who are focused on this region, are more cautious in their approach. For example, they say that in Afghanistan there have been continuous conflicts. There have been tribal rivalry and divide among the people, corruption and difficulties in the economy. These are issues that cannot be easily resolved, according to these experts. After the withdrawal of the U.S. forces, China might take part in economic activities, but it would not be easy to replace the U.S. And also, to begin with, can Taliban really effectively govern Afghanistan as a whole? The Chinese experts in this area are skeptical about this matter. Now, on the other hand, when we take a look at the failure in the management of the withdrawal process of the U.S. forces, it's not so much failure of the withdrawal, but it's more or less a failure in the management of the withdrawal process. And also the failure of 20-year Afghanistan involvement offers material for the Chinese to play up and argue its legitimacy. For example, the failure of democratic government under Karzai and Ghani under U.S. occupation indicate that the Western democracy is not the only universal value, because this represents a failure of the Western model. In particular, this is something that has been emphasized very strongly by China. Rather than the Western-style nation building, which attempts to establish political and governing system by military support for failed states such as Afghanistan, it would be more better to achieve peace through economic development. So, if China is successful in leading the Afghanistan reconstruction going forward, then this will actually express superiority over the U.S. model. But then China understands that this is not going to be an easy feat either. So that being the case, when we take a look at the Chinese posture toward Afghanistan going forward, in a nutshell, they are taking a wait-and-see attitude. It is still a work in process, and there is nothing certain about the Chinese posture. Under U.S. control, they were not able to come up with a governing government. Ethnic reconciliation, corruption, unity, and elimination of poverty and economic stability. These are not issues that can be easily be remedied by Taliban either. On August 29th, there was a foreign ministerial conference between U.S. and China over the phone. And during this phone conference, Wan-yi, the foreign minister of China, has expressed his views to Mr. Blinken. He says that they need to actively guide Taliban and should stop exerting pressure on China, on Taliban. So therefore, Mr. Wan-yi preached Mr. Blinken. But then, what type of actions will be taken by Taliban? Will they be effectively able to control Afghanistan? That is not yet clear. For example, this year as well, in the Balochistan area of Pakistan, there were some terrorist activities that targeted the Chinese, for example. And also quite recently, there was another terrorist attack by the IS within Afghanistan as well. As far as China is concerned, if Taliban can control the terrorist attacks and activities, then they will turn a blind eye to the human rights situation in domestic Taliban. And through not only bilateral, but through SCO and other multilateral frameworks, they want to establish a certain level of relationship. That is the attitude indicated by China. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese experts and the US experts who are well versed in this situation are all saying that they do not support the notion of Chinese military presence being heightened in order to fill the void left by the withdrawal of the United States. So exertion of influence by China in Afghanistan should be indirect over the long term and should be focused primarily on the academic aspects. So that is their prediction. But then, well, there's some, last but not least, with regard to the economy. Some point to the copper mines as well as development of rare earth. And there's some point that Chinese expect this. But then this is not a die-do-and-die situation. It is not a fatally important matter for Chinese. So therefore, the situation is not that Chinese capital can rapidly embark in Afghanistan. Of course, China is for Afghanistan is the largest trading partner. This applies to all the Chinese neighbors. But overwhelmingly, the exports exceed from China vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And this applies to other Central Asian nations as well. So therefore, the presence of China has become very strong. On the other hand, some are dissatisfied that the Belt and Road Initiative has not yet brought about profits which the local communities expected. So the Central Asian countries are now dissatisfied with the outcome of the Belt and Road Initiative. So one of the representative projects of Belt and Road Initiative is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And some view that this could be extended to cover Afghanistan as well. And the leaders of Taliban on September 2nd has had a phone conversation with Mr. Wu Jianghao, who is the Assistant Secretary of Foreign Ministry of China, and has indicated his wish to take part in Belt and Road Initiative. And the spokesperson for Afghanistan has said that they're interested in Belt and Road Initiative as well. But on the other hand, with regard to China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Pakistan side has now requested the possible debt deferral of the debt. So therefore, now we are now embarking on a phase to review the Belt and Road Initiative itself. So that being the case, China cannot very easily and casually embark on the economic activities in Afghanistan. I believe that is the case. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those of you who have questions, the chat box is already open, so if you could send over your questions through the chat box. So later we would like to take time to answer to your questions. Professor Inoue just explained to us what is the understanding of China over Afghanistan looking at the historical perspective. Some of the researchers in China says that to the Taliban and to the new government in Afghanistan, asking for political equity and also some economic assistance could be provided. The political equity without the government taking over, when the conditions are met, China will be willing to recognize the new government. But looking at the historical developments, and it seems that China has continued to be skeptical vis-a-vis Taliban, not that friendly. So whether Taliban will be able to bring the whole country under control or not is still a big question. Now, using military power, and China had to actively fill in the vacuum created by the United States in Afghanistan, I don't think that would happen. But asking for political equity and the economic assistance, how will China move forward? Everyone is watching very carefully. As was mentioned, to Afghanistan, more than $1 trillion worth of mineral resources, including rare earth and lithium, as well as copper, and also uranium that could be also used for the nuclear arms, and also the emerald, the ruby, gold, and silver. Such jewelry could be available, precious metals, but Afghanistan were not able to develop those mines. And China in the future may try to take initiative to develop those mines in Afghanistan. But as was explained just now, right at this moment, with China making investment, I don't think they would economically benefit, because there are many precarious elements to having projects being launched in Afghanistan. But still, China is mentioning possible economic assistance, meaning that China would like to indicate that it is not the enemy to Taliban, but would like to avoid the Taliban providing support to the Muslim minorities in China. So by receiving the presentation, there have been many questions been raised, but now I would like to ask Professor Takahara to raise questions and give his comment over the presentation made by Professor Inoue. Thank you. I don't think I will be able to add that much more information of Afghanistan, but in terms of relationship with Afghanistan, I have been to Afghanistan only once, and that was 42 years ago, in 1979. As Professor Inoue has introduced to us earlier, in December, the USSR has made a full-fledged military aggression. And in September, 3 months prior to that, I had the backpack, and I have traveled from Europe into Kabul. In 1979, some of you may remember, the Khomeini revolution occurred in Iran. The Islamic force and the communist forces. There have been massacres and murders, which would place Iran under control. There was a lot of chaos in Iran. So I have avoided Iran, and I have visited some of the republics in USSR, in the Minor Asia, and I went into Kabul from Tashkent. And after I arrived in the airport, there have been many Soviet soldiers. It was already in September. And since I visited Kabul, I went to Kandahar and also Herat. I have traversed the Afghanistan. But with the USSR supporting the Karachi, the group, the communist the force, and Mujahideen supported by U.S. There has been a fight going on. So USSR finally opted to make a full-fledged aggression. So in December, USSR has made aggression, and at the time, Japan has been saying that now the destiny has been fixed. Afghanistan is now strictly under control of USSR. And I have heard of that commentary, but I was skeptical myself. I had a lot of questions at that time. So that was the only experience directly visiting Afghanistan more than 4 decades ago. So I'm not that well informed on Afghanistan, but trying to sort out what the Professor Inoue has mentioned during the presentation, that is the only thing I will be able to do. Some of the points of interest of China, I would like to try to sort out and list those points. There are several points. Number one, the point of concern for China to do with its own national security. There are two major issues for China. One is, of course, the terrorist activities, especially in Xinjiang territory. They're trying to prevent any terrorist activists coming into the Xinjiang. It is only very short direct border with Afghanistan, and that could be fully controlled. But rather than trying to prevent the terrorists coming in, not from the border with Afghanistan, but coming through Tajikistan to the north of Afghanistan, that may be the concern for China. So stability needs to be brought to Afghanistan because of that perspective. And Tajikistan is quite important. As you may know, in Afghanistan, there are many Tajiks living inside Afghanistan, and Tajiks that have very poor relationship with Taliban. So the Afghanistan, the national military have collapsed, but many pilots and soldiers may have run away and gone into Tajikistan. So how the Tajiks may move going forward, that would be one important point in its relationship with China. The other would be drugs, narcotics. Taliban has already declared that it would no longer cultivate opium, poppies. But from the national security point of view, drug issue is a major issue for China. In the Yunnan province, coming in from Myanmar, there is a drug problem coming in. Although it is not reported that widely in the media, there is still a big problem of drugs for China. The second point is, as Mr. Ohara has pointed out, the economics. The trade in terms of amount is not big. Last year, between China and Afghanistan, it was $550 million. This year, it is growing, but in the first half, 44% increase. But in terms of absolute amount, it's not that large. Then what about investment? In cumulative basis, as of the end of June, it was $430 million. The famous would be the copper mine to the southwest of Kabul. So there's a great potential because it has more than $1 trillion worth of mineral resources are actually buried in Afghanistan. So political stability would be the big issue. And unless you have infrastructure well developed, you cannot really mine the mineral and transport the mineral. And infrastructure is very poor in Afghanistan. Now, as Professor Inoue has mentioned earlier, within China, there seems to be a divided view as to what should be the approach to be taken vis-à-vis Afghanistan. So there is a great potential in Afghanistan. So for those who are positive on Afghanistan, it would be something of a supportive the news. Now, so the second would be the economics. The third is the international politics. In terms of international political scene, over Afghanistan, China is working closely with Russia. China and Russia have been working closely for other issues, but in particular for Afghanistan, they are working very closely together because both countries welcome any decline in power of the United States. It would be positive for them because they are competing with the United States. So they would like to spread the discourse that U.S. cannot be trusted, U.S. cannot be relied upon. So you should give up on United States. So both China and Russia trying to spread that kind of discourse. But on the other hand, as Mr. Ohara has mentioned earlier, the United States will be shifting its political stance, so it could concentrate its power over China. So the Quad that has been strengthened to try to have the security issues in the back burner and have other issues come to the forefront, taking new initiatives. So the U.S. Biden administration is taking such endeavors. It would be a concern for China. So international politics is the third point. And the fourth point would be domestic politics. As was mentioned earlier, as I have also mentioned in my first point, of course, the terrorist activities would be one concern. And also, democracy is another issue, contentious issue for China. The Western style of a democracy should not be forced on the other countries. That is the statement made by China often. And this argument is something that we can accept, but China has gone even beyond that. The U.S. democracy, the American democracy, is the money democracy. It is for the wealthy. The U.S. presidential election is so costly. Unless you have money, you cannot win. On the other hand, the democracy in China is a people democracy, so it is a genuine democracy. But people like us think that that is going too far. So, in any case, domestic politics is another important issue for China, because lack of legitimacy is always the headache and point of concern for the Chinese leadership. So they would like to make a showcase of their own leadership and the government to be the legitimate one, and always the one who is correct and just. So they are taking the issue of Afghanistan for their purpose. And next year, it is a political season with the Communist Party convention to be held. And as is always said, in the next Chinese Communist Party at the convention, Xi Jinping would like to continue to be in the presidency, but they would have to have a very solid stance, domestically speaking, for that purpose. There are some dark clouds seen on the economic front, so especially on the political front, Xi Jinping would like to solidify his stance for legitimacy. So those are the four major points that we need to look at when we are discussing China. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. As you just mentioned, when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan, this also relates to the situation in the Middle East. So having heard Professor Takahara's comment, he talked about the positive and negative points for China. So failure of the U.S. and the unreliability of U.S. as an ally, and the decline of U.S. authority, and also the declining the authority over Western-style democracy. These two are issues which China is now playing up. But then this is the three war which is being waged by China, one of which covers the war over popular opinion. China wants to argue its superiority in terms of the governance. They also want to argue superiority over the Western system, and this represents a golden opportunity for China to do so. But in terms of the actual foreign policy, they are faced with various issues as well. For example, Taliban are Sunnis, but with such Iran welcomes the withdrawal of the U.S. But then Iran are actually leaders in Shias. So these two camps don't necessarily have a very positive relations. Now, China has good relations with Iran. But when it comes to Afghanistan and relationship with Afghanistan, out of concern for relationship with Afghanistan, if there should be conflict between Iran and Afghanistan, what will China do in that context? And also, when USSR invaded Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia supported Afghanistan and fought with USSR. So what about Saudi's relationship with Iran? This is well clear. So therefore, the situation in Afghanistan could have some implications for the Middle East as a whole. If that is the case, as far as China is concerned, considering that they're reliant on the Middle East for most part of its import of oil, this situation might have implications there. And going further toward the western part of China, various issues could arise down the road. Also, U.S. has let go of its burden called Afghanistan, and the U.S. no longer needs to be considered to make consideration vis-a-vis Pakistan, which means that U.S. posture may change. So therefore, the Quad itself could become even more stronger and more robust. But on the other hand, India is concerned about the possible situation where Pakistan could seek greater military support from China. If that is the case, then India is interested in not the Indo-Pacific corridor, but they're more concentrated in Pakistan. Their interest is more toward west. So there's a divergence of direction. So they talk about strengthening cooperation, but it's not so much in the Pacific. With regard to China's-Pakistan collaboration, India wants to compete that by having greater collaboration with U.S. But then as far as China is concerned, greater solidarity of the Quad is something that they want to avoid most strongly in terms of diplomacy. So therefore, China is now engaged in a very active approach toward India. They also want to resolve the border conflict. So against that backdrop, as far as China is concerned, they may not offer full and support to Pakistan. As far as India is concerned, they are a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. So China and India, and the conflict between China and India, and the conflict between China and the Quad, how will India be treated? That represents a very difficult challenge for China. So as you can see, well, in terms of public policy, public relations, China is playing up the operational failure of U.S. in their withdrawal from Afghanistan. But on the other hand, in terms of foreign policy, China is faced with very difficult challenges. So as far as China is concerned, they are faced with these two contradictions. And going forward, how will they try to make these two issues more compatible? I would like to invite comments from Dr. Takahara and Dr. Inoue as well. In the interest of time, I would ask you to be very short in your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. What Mr. Ohara has pointed out is a highly complicated situation. The countries to the east of China, for each of those countries, they have different relationship with China. And inside their own countries, there's highly complicated situation. So we need to try to bring an answer to highly complex, the simultaneous equations, so to speak. But we need to also think about the relationship with the United States. The Afghanistan, in terms of priority, it is not that high. But on the other hand, terrorist activity is a point of great concern. The situation right now is still in flux, so we need to wait and see what would happen going forward.
Thank you very much. Professor Takahara, it was mentioned that the greatest risk for China is still the United States. So the recognition of China, is it about U.S. or is it domestic terrorism? Inclusive of this, I would like to invite the views from Professor Takahara, please. The floor is yours, sir. Yes, thank you very much. As far as China is concerned, as Professor Inoue just mentioned, the most important issue and the greatest threat is the United States. Xi Jinping has made such remarks himself. So I think that is where their focus is at this moment. So I agree with Professor Inoue's assessment on this point. So that being the case, its relations with India needs to be put on the path for stable development. That's what China would like to do. So for example, when it comes to Tibet and India, the border issues in relation to India and Tibet, they don't want to casually act and PLA. They've instructed PLA to remain very quiet. I think that is Xi Jinping's thinking at this moment. Now, recently, the Western Command, and I would like to ask Mr. Ohara, as you know, the commander seems to be changing every few months. So the top leadership has changed 3 times actually in the recent situation. So this is not ordinary. I wonder what this means. Maybe relationship with India is maybe one factor in the frequent change in the military command toward the West. I'm not sure about the situation, but they want to overcome and they'll be able to ride the political party convention next year. This is the major challenge for Xi Jinping. And if that is the central focal point, then they want to stabilize this relationship with the U.S. and they also want to stabilize this relationship with India. So foreign policy, as far as on the foreign policy front, they want to maintain an advantageous situation for China. That's what they need to create. So I believe that is the greatest goal that the Chinese government has as it embarks on foreign policy. I believe that is going to be the current situation for some time.
Thank you very much. Looking at the commanders in China, they're being changed frequently. Of course, there are many reasoning being posited. But ultimately, Xi Jinping would like to have a person who would strictly follow his instructions as a commander. Xi Jinping says that the integration and unity of the Chinese territory would be the big resumption of the great Chinese the race. But of course, he has Taiwan in his mind, and they would have to have good results. And he would have to bring any rash acts and behaviors under control. And Xi Jinping's instructions must be followed through, and also to show the solid presence of China. That would be a very difficult the role and mission to be the post. If that commandant stays too long in a certain region, the contact with the local community become too intense. That would pose a very delicate question. So we have heard the views on China in terms of diplomacy. But the other major point, which is economics, as Professor Takahara had said, mineral resources of more than $1 trillion worth. Afghanistan is blessed with such minerals. And the United States is trying to reconstruct its supply chain. And China would also like to bring in many productions for domestic industries. So they would like to also to have such mineral resources available. But then from 2017, direct investment has been placed under very strict control. An actual amount of direct investment is actually decreasing. So from diplomatic point of view, to increase investment in Afghanistan, is this possible for China? And India has made investments into Afghanistan as well. But looking at the present situation, I don't think India can continue to invest into Afghanistan. Now, on the other hand, for China to increase her investment into China, there are a lot of alarm over the China trying to monopolize. So Afghanistan, all the other countries would like to work with the other countries, such as the U.S. and Japan, to try to develop its economy. But China, on the other hand, would be against that. From political point of view, economic assistance should be given. So inside China, coordination and adjustment of policies need to be done. There are questions. Although the remaining time is very short, I would like to ask 2 professors to respond to those questions. Through Pakistan, indirectly, to support Taliban would be something the Communist Party often tend to do. But what about the common interest of the China? Is it in congruence with Pakistan? How about Russia and China? That that they could make influence over the Taliban. I am not a regional expert. I'm not expert on this region, so I cannot give you any details. But looking at Pakistan, rather than Afghanistan itself, Pakistan has continued to support Taliban. That is the history up until now. So China has concern and worries over Taliban, but the position of Pakistan may be rather different from China. What about China and Russia? I can say something only in abstract, but because of the past historical problems, so in terms of strategic interests, not only Afghanistan, but for whole of Central Asia, I don't think China and Russia has any congruence or confluence of interests. If too rapidly China to increase its presence in Afghanistan, of course Russia would be concerned. So SCO would work as a buffer because it is a multilateral framework. So China would continue to utilize the SCO.
Professor Takahara, your views, please. I don't have anything specifically to add to what was just shared. With regard to Russia, I believe it is as Dr. Inoue mentioned, I think he has covered it. Generally speaking, China and Russia are trying to maximize their common interests. They're trying to take joint actions on various fronts. And by doing so, they want to maximize their interest. But having said that, when you focus on the details, when you take a look at the long-term situation outlook, especially the Russian side has various concerns on their part. As far as Pakistan is concerned, how can I put it? On the surface, the relations between China and Pakistan seems to be very positive on all fronts. It's been pointed out that they are partners in terms of all aspects. But then when it comes to issues that are relevant to terrorism, which is very important for China, are they 100% placing confidence on another country? Do they believe that they can remain quiet, giving confidence 100% to another country? That is probably not the case. When it comes to Afghanistan, I think they want to, on their own, involve with various forces within Afghanistan. It could be the same thing could say about Pakistan. They're not monolithic either. So they want to say that they have good relations with the various forces and groups within Afghanistan. That's the Chinese way, and that's what the Chinese are approaching. And I believe that is the same approach they're going to take vis-a-vis Afghanistan as well.
Thank you very much. There is another question. On this issue, the relationship with India needs to be taken into consideration. If you try to come closer to Pakistan, India would be alarmed and may try to approach the United States. The Quad that may be a point of contention. And India could be separated. So I don't think that Pakistan would be put in the forefront. Now, there is another question, and I would like to ask Professor Inoue to respond. Looking at Taliban in Afghanistan, if they could have a border control and the guard at the border, it will be convenient to China, so it may not have that much of sense of crisis because the Taliban is fighting with the IS. So perhaps China could ask the Taliban to continue to guard the border. Now, between China and Taliban, to what extent they have their interests have been agreed or coincided, we cannot really understand. I don't think they still yet have any trust and confidence relationship at all. And from several years ago, there has been communication ongoing between China and Taliban. That is true. And as Minister Wang Yi has said, so going forward, for China, Taliban should be brought over and nurtured to be a positive factor for China, not to make any harm to China. So I don't think there is any mature relationship yet between the two.
Thank you very much. As was mentioned, when it comes to relations between China and Taliban, It's been said that they have had series of negotiations over the past. That has become very clear. That is because China has a sense of concern and urgency over this region. Going forward, China is likely to be involved in this region in many ways. Is it a very proactive military involvement? That is not likely to be the case. They want to demonstrate that China is not the enemy. China is the party that can offer assistance. That is the way in which China is likely to be engaged in this region. So last but not least, I would like to appreciate comments very shortly from the two speakers. China, you mentioned that they're taking a wait-and-see attitude. What about Japan? How should Japan see the current situation? I would like to ask on this point. These two are authorities in China, and maybe this is a question that should be addressed to Chinese experts like yourselves. But I appreciate some perspectives from the Japanese side, starting from Professor Inoue, please. Yes, thank you. As far as Japan is concerned, Japan has not had a major scale involvement in Afghanistan. In the peace process they offer through academic cooperation, Japan was involved. That is a major involvement. So they have been able to build a relationship of trust based on that cooperation. So that should be continued. But then, of course, considering the Taliban, the situation is still not clear, but that is the situation.
Thank you very much, so Professor Takahara. For the stability of the region, for that purpose, and from the humanitarian assistance perspective, the other countries need to work closely together so that collaboration could proceed. So more practical support could be given. We should take a positive and proactive action forward.
Thank you. As time has come, we would like to conclude the session at this time. When it comes to the Chinese perception of the situation in Afghanistan and towards Taliban, it is not yet solidified, but we had a discussion against such a backdrop. But I believe how China will be involved in Afghanistan going forward is something that will require greater attention on our part. Thank you for your attendance today. We appreciate your participation. We'd like to conclude the session at this juncture. Thank you very much for joining us today. Good day. This completes SPF China Observer, China's public forum. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us.